All right, we're live. Today I have with me Connor,
Hello.
Milo, and Jonathan. And all right, they're on board and excited. And what I was just telling them before we went live is that I want to do sort of a series of this type of segment for like an hour or two every week or 2 or 3 weeks and get this feedback from a variety of people on things that they would call religious experiences or experience with something of a divine nature or spiritual nature, and that could include things, well, a wide variety of things that we'll get into, whether that's somehow seems to be directly God or religious related. And the other thing I was mentioning too is that I want to try to find the commonalities and contrasts, similar to how personality is a invisible thing, but we can call it an empirical psychometric because there's just so many consistent variables, even if you just go off of people's surveys or go off of people's answering relatively straightforward questions. So, but for the most part today and in these sort of segments, I'd like to try to do is I just want to just generally get people to talk about their sort of religious experiences. I'll weave in some of mine, but today I mostly want to hear from these three guys. So, and we'll just also discuss it and give each other feedback. So, let me hear from you three guys briefly, especially Connor and Milo, as they have been a little busy lately. So it's good to have them back. So Connor, just say a couple things for a minute, and then we'll hear from the other guys and get into it.
Yeah, I get caught up a lot saying that I think religion at its core is really just an experience. My experience with mystical experiences is pretty much, at least at first, it was kind of self-induced, so like pharmacologically induced. And I feel like one of the problems that caused is I wanted to tell a lot of people about it. And one thing I found as I got older is I noticed that people who had earned their mystical experiences by putting in the work and, putting in the proper research and the proper insight didn't really talk about it that much. And that's one thing I wish I would have known back then. And I think that speaks to, I quote this quote a lot, but Carl Jung once said, beware of wisdom that you did not earn. And I think I did have a few mystical experiences that I definitely didn't earn. So that's a big thing for me. The only other thing I would add to that is just that I think the difficulty with discussing religious experiences is that they can't be quantified, kind of like a thought, I could tell you that I thought something, but I could never prove it to you. There's no way to connect my brain to a computer that would translate my thoughts into words on a screen or pictures on a screen. You just kind of have to take my word for it. I do think that the experience happens enough to where we have to take it seriously. But I think, and I do think that the religious experience is one aspect where atheists and maybe religious people can unite on. And I've seen this happen in my own life. I've seen atheists go to the direction of saying, well, okay, maybe religion had a function in our past. And I've seen religious people move more towards a fundamentalist view to the experience view. I think the question that creates is, what is the current status of religion? And I think that's going to be a difficult discussion, but I think we could probably hash that out.
Okay. Yeah, Milo, let me hear a couple ideas from you, and then we'll start to get into it.
Well, I had a mystical experience when I was like 14, almost 15. And it was like when I was in a state of depression, like, like meaningless, existential, like just kind of didn't see the purpose in life, didn't see the point to anything. And I was completely emptied out. And I just kind of, I didn't have like any theological concept of God at that moment. There was no real theology, but I opened myself and I was like, God, whoever you are, whatever, just do whatever you want with me, because I'm done. I couldn't see any way forward. And I experienced like I don't know, kind of a state of bliss where I was kind of just wave after wave of feeling a sense of love. And I don't know how else to explain it, but it went on for like 8 hours.
Wow.
And
by the way, was this something you were doing alone at the time, or were you with a group?
I was alone.
Okay.
Just in my bedroom. I wasn't in any lotus position or nothing. I'm just laying on my bed. I mean, it wasn't, but I was awake all night, and the next morning I was just like, my personality was altered. I didn't, and I kind of felt like my old self was all wrong. But my whole life since then has been really, I don't know, coming to grips with it. It's kind of driven my whole life journey from that point forward. I mean, I've interpreted it in many different ways over the years, but it is something that, but you just can't put it into words. You can't express it to anybody. I mean, there's just no way that you can tell somebody what it is, or it's but it is something that like compels you. I mean, you can't run from it. It leaves like an imprint on you that's always with you. I mean, you can kind of try to run from it, but you can't really do that for very long. So at least that's been my experience. I could say more, but that's an intro anyhow.
Okay, good intro. All right, Jonathan. Just if you want to say anything about maybe, I think you said that when you were younger you had some kind of something. So just anything that you may have had along those lines, briefly, and then we'll start to get into it.
Right.
Or just your opinions on it.
Sure. Yeah. And again, I'm the atheist / agnostic in the room, but I'm interested in figuring this stuff out. Right. So, I'm not sure if there's a difference, or if we want to quantify a difference between a religious, spiritual experience and a mystical experience. I don't know if we should use those interchangeably or not, but I suppose since I haven't taken any psychedelics, I think that's the only place I can really go is spiritual experience.
Okay.
So I was raised in a fundamentalist Pentecostal Church of God home, and my parents were very spiritual, very, they prayed all the time. And I remember having spiritual experiences as early as 3. I remember, for example, one time we got lost in our little car on the highway, and I have a, big fear of being lost anywhere. I always have. And my parents claimed that I spoke in tongues at like 3 in the car once. So I don't know how to, I don't know how to figure that out. But another example was I had what you could call a spiritual experience. I was just walking my dog once, back when my parents were alive, and I lived back at the brick rancher I was an undergrad. And it was a perfectly clear night. Like there was nothing but stars out. And I looked up into the stars, and I felt that connectedness that Connor mentioned earlier before we went live. And I felt like God was speaking, not audibly, but, in the soul, spiritual sense of speaking. So yeah, I've had a couple of those, more minor examples of that when I was religious. So yeah, I think mystical experiences are real, and I think they're one of the interesting points of contact between the secular viewpoint and the sort of more spiritual religious viewpoint, because like, you know, and we can get into the gateways for them, whatever they may be, drugs, whatever, psychedelics,
Meditation.
right. But the only thing I would say I'm cautious of is attesting any metaphysics to those experiences. That's where I want to draw a line at, and we might need to hash that out, because that's something BJ mentioned when we were in on Facebook comments, is that subjective experiences don't give you license to talk about the objective world, except in the sense that it allows you to talk about the potential, the possibilities of experience. It does allow you to talk about that, but just having an experience about one thing doesn't give you license to talk about the physics of quantum particles, for example. So that's where I think we might go there eventually, but let's see where it goes from here. So I'll end it there.
Okay. All right. I guess sure. I will give a little bit on my background before you get into it from everybody. But okay, so I had a more, I guess, spiritual religious background in the past. It was mainly a Pentecostal background, but not Church of God. It was United Pentecostal Church International, but very similar to those. But yeah, they're more of the experiential type than, you know, the just ritualistic and legalistic type. And it's very much about having a prayerful relationship with God or your faith, and not just you know, something you do here and there ritualistically, fundamentally, or when you go to church and all that. So I've had a lot of those experiences, and I still do. And we can get into some of the more details of those at some point, probably. And then, but I don't know. One of the kind of things that I want to kind of get into is, and I'm trying to figure out how to word this too, is just that I think everybody's kind of, okay, so like sometimes I think of it as how sometimes we talk about how at night our dreams are like this, and during the day our consciousness is like this. But I feel like, and I don't know how empirical or scientific this is, but you know, our subconscious is always going at the same time, which is kind of like us at a more spiritual level. And our subconscious or unconscious is trying to solve bigger problems, or it's trying to help us mature, I guess, and grow, and not just in a materialistic way, but in a sort of our soul to grow into what it really is and fight off some of the misconceptions and the bad habits. And so I feel like these things are always going on some level, even if you just want to call it like the battle of the unconscious and conscious mind to some degree. And so I don't know if I'll get into all of it today, but then a couple years ago, when I was going through just like sort of my midlife crisis anyway, like finishing my divorce, and a friend passed away from cancer at the same time as he was a business partner. So then I was going through like changes of my business. It was kind of like one of those existential states, similar to how Milo said we can get sometimes. And I think that's important, because it's kind of like how normally when things are going great, we've kind of got our sort of like fundamental frame set up of how we think the world works, and how we set up sort of our axioms and our value structures. And that kind of like protects us from that sort of existential threat experience, is when we have that. So we can just operate in the world and everything will seem great, which is good. It helps us be productive and all that. But so anyway, I mentioned that time because then I was like just going through various experiences, both in, I guess, prayer, but also at the same time deeply questioning everything, including, you know, the nature of my faith, the nature of the church and how it's set up, and just society and myself and my position and all that, and all the endless conflict and all that. And also I was like trying to be I was going through one conflict of, I felt like sometimes in life when we go through these times, what we'll do is we'll you know, if you go through a breakup, or you lose a job, or you lose a friend, whether that's for any reason or death or anything, sometimes we just like try to get back in it so that we don't have to really experience it and feel it. And so what I was trying to do is break that habit too, and which is kind of like what I've been doing, as some of what you've seen in my like Facebook group, is instead of just going back and getting busy to kind of cover things up, really experience that and kind of like flesh out and question everything and try everything and explore every question.
Right.
And so that's kind of been like the journey. At that time, I was also kind of like just like trying to be super social when I could. And I did some social drugs. And so that's why I wanted to mention, I didn't do necessarily psychedelics, but I mentioned it a couple of times how that it was a similar experience. Because like I said, I'm trying to like iron out these questions and sort of like the ongoing religious experience that I think kind of like life is an ongoing religious experience, but we kind of like set up our narratives to kind of protect us from it or keep us busy so we don't really maybe experience it in such a what could be a painful way. And so anyway, so on that, at that time, that was kind of a thing that really, when I was basically tripping on Molly one time, I felt, and it's not something I would recommend doing more than, I don't know, like I only did it like 2 or 3 times. That's probably the most I'd recommend, at least for a long period of time. But I talked about it a little bit on some of my Facebook posts and some images that came to my head and some ideas at that time. But it was just this idea of how to, and you guys mentioned it a little bit earlier, these ideas of how to, it's sort of like a feeling of deep empathy and a deep connection, love, but more like compassion, and how to help other people make it through those kind of things, and help others mature and grow and make it through those kind of things. And which was important to me too, because at about that same time, I had one thing I was trying to do instead of just get busy is help others too, if I could, because that's one thing that I kind of figured out at that time was what was helping me get through is if there's any way that I could help, you know, my friend's family with the funeral and everything, or them, that they needed a place to live for a little bit, and those kind of things. So it was like because I feel like one thing that comes natural to us, like you see it in children even, is this idea of, you know, compassion and love and empathy are very natural, but we protect ourselves from those because, you know, trust issues or fear or insecurity or whatever. So it's like a leap of faith to try to figure out how to properly, you know, do those in the world, especially because you don't want to get sucked into these sort of like virtue signaling, egotistical traps that we you know talk about sometimes. So that's kind of like my little brief overview. But I do believe that the religious experience is something that's kind of always there, but it's just very hard to you know, quantify and put into words, because it's something that's very much it's it's beyond words and vocabulary, but I just want to kind of give some brief, if possible, some of my background in that. And but for the most part today, I want to hear from you guys, especially Connor and Milo today.
I thought it was interesting that you talked about praying and also questioning everything at the same time, because I apologize for getting into a little bit of like etymology here, but
Sure, no problem.
if you ask a Jew what they mean by prayer, it's a lot different than our understanding of it.
Right.
They really refer to it more as like a contemplation of yourself in the universe, which, by the way, I think is much more difficult than just talking to God.
Right.
I think it's a big difference. And, also that kind of reminds me of what you were saying earlier, Jonathan. You were talking about whether or not to call this a spiritual or a metaphysical or a mystical experience. I'm sorry. And I think the reason why I prefer to call it a mystical experience is because the word spiritual, it inferences that we have a spirit. And by the way, I'm not denying that we have a spirit. I just find that when I'm talking to people who are maybe atheistic or agnostic, they don't like the smuggling of the spirit into the conversation. I think a mystical experience more so implies that it's mysterious and it can't be quantified, and it's just unique. So I'm kind of curious to see what your thoughts are on that.
I've never encountered any situation where an atheist was uncomfortable with the word spiritual. I think what they're uncomfortable with is not necessarily smuggling the word spirit, but Jesus smuggling. That might be a better way to say it, from Douglas Murray. But I don't even know if the word mystical experience is really that offensive either.
I think it's a lot less offensive to an atheist than the word spiritual, because spirit does imply that there are spirits and that maybe we have a spirit, and maybe to an extent I do believe that, but I think a more universal term for people who don't believe in spirits and people who do is mystical.
Right. It gives a sense of supernatural things going on. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, so I do happen to know that, like, for example, there's a YouTube series of science music videos. I don't know who actually made these, but they remix snippets of nice statements and quotes by people like Dawkins or Harris or Dennett or whatever, or Sagan. And one of them was that the same spirituality and religion can be found in science, or not fundamentalist religious practices. So I do see a sort of push to get spiritual, to not have religion hijack spirituality. It's coming from the secular side.
I will say it's interesting, and maybe you guys have more background and understanding on some of that, because lately, I don't know, it kind of almost seemed it's hard to figure out exactly what's going on the last few years with these new atheists, like Sam Harris in particular. He'll often talk about, I haven't seen a lot of his stuff, but he will talk about how, like, I've seen even YouTube videos where he's like kind of guiding people through meditation and say, like, look, here's kind of like a spiritual religious type of feeling, but that doesn't mean that there's a God necessarily or anything metaphysical. That's just, and he'll talk about it in Buddhism a lot, and how, like, look, Buddhism has been around for like 5,000 years, and it doesn't mean that Buddhism is the way, but they have figured out this way to tap into our deepest levels of consciousness, or I'm not sure exactly the terminology he uses, but something along those lines. And I do feel like there's a lot of value in everybody trying to, if we can, come together on the language, even if it's saying spiritual, but a what do you call it? A spiritual or religious person might mean or think this by it, but a Sam Harris type person might understand what they mean, but also still be able to talk to with them about it and understand how they understand the terminology differently.
Yeah, well, I don't think we can have a conversation about religious experiences without talking about meditation. That's actually, I appreciate Sam Harris, because he's actually, to be willing to accept meditation given its religious context, I think is pretty admirable. I do think that there's a lot of similarities between meditational experiences and religious experiences that we can talk about. And I also wonder about not just the neurological, but the spiritual implications of meditation. And I kind of want to refer to Milo too, because it kind of sounds like what you had might have been some form of unplanned meditative experience that was bestowed upon you without you trying to invoke it in any way. And I find that interesting as well.
Yeah.
I found, all my reading and whatnot, I've interpreted my experience in a number of different ways. I think Carl Jung, in his concept of the psyche, where he would talk about, you have your ego consciousness. This is the self that we kind of identify with through most of our life. And but then there's a deeper self inside that we're identified with our conscious ego self, but there's something else that's deep in our psyche, a self that is more than just what we're conscious of, and that self does not come to life until the conscious ego self is willing to let go of its rulership over its self-identity.
Right.
And this aligns with my experience in the sense that forms of meditation is really overcoming identification with our thoughts, with our feelings, with people, with emotions. We get identified with things in this world, and that prevents the deeper self from manifesting. And this corresponds with my experience. In that way, that conceptualization is probably the clearest conceptualization that I've bumped into, that kind of at least like shows the the territory of of what's going on, because in meditation you're working on letting go of ego attachment, and you can see this both in Eastern and Western mysticism, but that you guys can like chime in here. I think that.
Well, it's interesting. Our ancestors didn't know the word ego, and you maybe can even make the argument that they hadn't yet identified it. And I actually think that's where things like angelology, which is the study of angels, is like it comes from, which is kind of like a nascent form of psychology. It's the idea that there are forces that kind of compel you to act in a certain way or invoke certain emotions. It's kind of where the idea of possession comes from. It's like, if something happens to me, I'm possessed by an emotion. I have no control over it. And too, I think it's like another part of that I think is even deeper is like the idea that, we have thoughts, we have emotions, and I think we get really caught up in the idea that they're somehow separate from the rest of the universe. But can't be true, right? I mean, your thoughts and your emotions exist in the same space and time that the matter around you exists in. So in a way that they are interacting. And I think that's ultimately what causes the invocation of these, possessions, if you will.
It's like what Jung says. He says that you don't have ideas have you.
Correct.
Yeah, well,
that's what exactly.
But by the way, one thing that I didn't mention that I wanted to get into, what like I've had a lot of dream experiences and some waking and some years ago with what's not myself exactly, but with witnessing what seemed to be devil possession, and also just like these okay, there's like ideological possessions, there's idea possession, like we were mentioned, But then there's just so many where it's just like it's we kind of act like we're always the master on our own house, our own temple
Right.
of our body slash being individually, but that's mostly an act,
Right. Don't you think that's kind of like a declaration of the inability to understand the subconscious, to say that you're the master of everything that you feel and think all the time? And I think that's fundamentally incorrect.
Yeah. So I guess the other area that I want to get into a little bit today is the contrast that there's definitely some experiences like the ones we've described a little bit that seem, maybe they aren't necessarily divine, like whatever people think of as God exactly, but maybe they could be. We don't know for sure.
We know our ancestors deemed them as divine.
Yeah,
that's what we can say. We know for sure.
Yeah, and we're still figuring these things out, or figuring out how to talk about them too. But then also there's other experiences, whether they're in dreams or ourselves or other people, where it seems like something, a similar experience, but the opposite, in that rather than these good revelatory experiences like we described, they were the opposite, where it seemed of something evil and something that would grip us to go and do things that we really didn't want to do and that we knew we shouldn't do, and those kind of things. So has anybody had those kind of experiences at all?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly had recurring nightmares.
Yeah.
Which, made me realize that, like, I remember my first nightmare, or at least the first one I remember. There's an interesting discussion to be had about the fact that you have dreams that you don't remember, and how are they really influencing you from day to day. But the first one that I was actually conscious of, I actually remember being like 6 years old and realizing, like, oh, like, I don't have autonomy over my dreams. It's not like I'm dreaming, it's like something in me is dreaming and I have no control over it.
Yeah, you're just kind of like there for the ride.
Right.
On that,
go ahead.
On that subject, like in Jung would say, like, the more you're identified with if you identify yourself as a saint, let's say, then you more or less create the devil in your unconscious.
Right.
And so when you look, and his thinking was that we're kind of a grouping of many polarities, our psyche is, and if we focus too much on one, we create the other.
Right.
So if you have a resurgence of darkness that comes up in a dream or whatnot, it's compensating for an excessive positive energy in your consciousness.
Sure.
And so like he would say, if you ever run into the devil in your dream, be sure to have a conversation with him, because he's your devil.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that comes out the same way often in just societal projection, like how we've always, it's something I talk about a lot, how that, we always feel like we need to have an enemy, even if it's just some random stranger or the president or whoever. And to some degree, that's true. We need to be a little bit suspicious of other people, but to a large degree, we need to always recognize that we are each our own primary enemy. But we project these things out on the world because it's like an escape from having to deal with what's inside of us.
Right.
So if we can say this and that person is so evil, and this and that person is the devil, or this group is so evil and horrible, then we don't have to, not only we don't have to deal with our own devils or our own evil inside, but also we can inflate our own ego, and in the process of doing so, we act like it's some saintly act. Like that's what happens a lot of times with these movements. You could probably say mostly on the left, where they're try to find these victims and go to their rescue,
Right.
and then they can project the other side as evil. Although one thing I like to call out sometimes is then the other side, let's say the conservatives, then they'll be like, oh no, look how evil that the liberals are being for doing this. But then it's just makes that cycle perpetuate forever. Whereas
it's shadow
the only way
boxing.
out of it is the only way out of it is to call it out. Just sort of like what I just did, is to say, look, we're all screwed up and we're all victims, but the best way to deal with it is that each person deal with what they can on their own, which is starting with themselves. So that's sort of the phenomenon of like projecting evil on others. But go ahead.
I'll tell you something embarrassing about me. When I went through my there's no other way to sound it without kind of sounding like a douche. But when I went through my spiritual transformation, or whatever you would call it, the year of time where I became interested in things that were radically different than things that I was interested in before.
How long ago was this, by the way?
Maybe 5 years, maybe 4 years.
Okay.
4 or 5 years. I noticed that my anxiety subsided. And so I had convinced myself of this nice little fairy tale that I had beat my anxiety. I had told myself, and it lasted for, 4 years, 5 years. And then all it took was for a global pandemic to happen for me to have like an anxiety attack again. And it was funny because my initial thought when I was experiencing it was that I was like, okay, well, that's not me. It's not being generated from me. It's being generated from everything that's being inculcated into me from the media and from what I'm watching. And it took me a while to realize. So my point is, I read this book called The Untethered Soul. Have any of you guys read that book?
No.
The book is about kind of what Milo was talking about how the core of what you are is an observer. Yep. It's something that's watching the things inside of you unfold. So you can think of this like when you look up to the sky, you can see that the sky is blue. But for whatever reason, that voice comes along afterwards and says, that sky is blue. And there's it doesn't seem like there's any real reason why that should happen. If I can see that this wall is white, there's no reason why the voice should have to come up afterwards and say that wall is white. And I think part of having a spiritual experience is acknowledging that I'm not just this one monolith, right? Like I'm a subset of different things that want their own that want to manifest their own realities through me. Like I'm almost like a conduit, right? And it's kind of interesting, and I'm kind of curious what Jonathan thinks about that, because kind of what I was saying earlier about how your thoughts, they interact with the rest of the universe. Like, do you think that there will ever come a time where like empiricism can quantify that? Like not just the fact that I have hands and I have a body that interacts with the world, but how do you think thoughts and feelings interact with the world? If you had to speculate, or not even if you had to speculate, but how do you speculate that will transgress as a science in the future, or if it will?
Yeah, well, I mean, even Carl Sagan said our thoughts and feelings aren't under our own control, right? So it would be really foolish to suggest that, well, your question somewhat needs a preface, which is, are you a determinist or not? Because if you are a determinist,
we shouldn't go there right now.
I know, but the point, I don't think anyone here is an indeterminist, or I wouldn't know, but so for example, there are studies that have suggested that this goes back to what Connor was saying about the thought comes after the experience, in some sense, the voice.
Right. That's a good way to say it.
Yeah. So they did a study where I think someone made a decision and their brain illuminated, they scanned their brain and they saw certain regions light up that indicated they were making a decision. And they didn't actually report that they had made the decision until something like 6 or 7 seconds later. So it's almost as if their brain was deciding things before they were aware of the decision that they were supposedly making. So that begs the question of, okay, well, things interact with us and we can't control it, but our own minds do things that we aren't aware of.
Yeah.
So I definitely don't think that we are just this source of, you can imagine, okay, there's this darkness, the world is darkness, and we're just this lamp making light. No, it's all one big chaotic mess. And
I like to think of it as nodes in a network.
Right. That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Jung would say that the self, that is the self that comprises the whole psyche, not just our conscious self.
Individual psyche, by the way.
What's that?
The individual psyche.
Well, yeah, my psyche. Say, but he would say that self, is not bound by time, and this led him to the idea of synchronicity. That
was the first book I read by Jung, by the way.
Yeah, so the self not being bound by time, led to that. And he also would say, though, that the experience of the self was psychologically indistinguishable from an experience with God.
I'm gonna fact check myself here. I just got this. This was a 2008 discovery. It's not 7. It's actually 10 seconds.
Oh.
It's 10 seconds.
Oh,
even
okay.
longer than that. 10 seconds is a lifetime in the brain. That's a huge.
Oh,
amount.
yeah.
Well, another interesting thing about that is that we call the time of death when the heart stops.
Yeah.
Yet, there's plenty of videos of bodies raising their hand in the air and holding it up there. So it makes me wonder, like, when are you really dead? Like, when do you really?
I think
when are the last processes really over?
Right. I think if you're talking about the death of you, whatever that means with consciousness, I think we have to define death for humans to be brain death, or at least whatever is death that sufficiently destroys any complex or otherwise thought processes or any kind of subconscious thought processes that could occur. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, when people are having, and my dad had this one of the things that I remember so vividly when I was religious is he told me stories about how he, in 1982, he had a triple heart attack and he died several times. I think he had 2 cardiac arrests, and then he had a enlargement of the heart that caused a fever, and so he went into a fever-induced coma. And he told me stories about how he saw angels, he saw Jesus, he saw all these things, and when he was dead, he had experiences. He was experiencing things, So, regardless of what your take is on naturalism versus supernaturalism, those are experiences, and that tells you that there's something there having those experiences, which means there's something there to have an experience. So the brain is doing things even after the heart stops. I think there was one visceral example of that is somebody did an experiment where, and this was like a long time ago, where people used to get beheaded or whatever, back in the 1800s, and I think he was a psychologist. I might search for the name. And he was condemned to die by beheading. And he told the person who was there to check to make sure he was, actually headless, he was going to blink 17 as many times as he could after his head was chopped off. And the guy reported that he blinked like 17 times or something. Now that's a huge amount of activity going on without even oxygen, a body, nothing, So that I guess that's the extreme side of it, So
yeah, and even brain injuries, like not to be too graphic, but if someone puts a knife through your brain, not to be too graphic, but even though you're dead, you're not alive anymore. things still happen, like the jaw clenches and, you know, your body tenses up and all these things happen. And it really speaks to the idea. I think dreams are really the best example of this, because dreams are like one of those things that you can, and I wonder like how much a death experience is kind of like a dream, you know? Your body's not in motion, your body's incapable of operating autonomously, but yet you still have these experiences kind of like you do every night when you go to sleep.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's the exact same process.
It's not, but
it's probably it's in the same dimension, let's call it, in the wherever the dreams take place in the brain and the types of things you see.
Yeah, you know, it's like my dad. When he was younger, he had a thyroid operation, and back then their anesthesia was different than it is today. And he said he watched them operate on him from the ceiling of the room, the whole operation. He was watching them. You know, his eyes are closed.
I've heard that before.
He's laying on the table. Yeah, there's a number of reports of similar types of experiences, but you know, I mean, his eyes are closed. He's laying on a table. He's being operated on, and he's watching the whole thing from above him. He's watching his own body.
I've heard a lot of those.
So I don't know if you guys ever get a chance to watch a movie. It's called Beyond Our Sight. You know, look, you know, it's an anecdotal movie. They're interviewing people who have legally died on the operating table, and those people are expected to give their best recollection of what happened. But what you find, the reason why I like the movie is because I can kind of tell that those people really have no reason to lie. You find that that's a really common experience when people die. It's almost as if their consciousness is shot out of their body. They're above themselves, watching themselves die, and just the sheer fact that there's a similarity between the experiences is what makes me intrigued by it. Because it would be different if, like, you know, everybody who legally died experienced this radically different experience. Maybe one person went up and saw fractals, the other person met a god, or the other person met like a spirit guide or something like that. But the reason why it's interesting to me is because it's all the same. And that makes me wonder, like, okay, on a more, you know, rooted in science idea, is it just that the brain is really calculated and having this experience the same way? Or is it that there's some metaphysical reality? And we should talk about the word metaphysics, but it makes me wonder, like, you know, how much of that is objectively true and how much of that is subjective.
Well, I would say it at the very least, it goes in the same category as dreams, especially because in our dreams.
But dreams are radically different. Everybody's dreams are radically different.
Yeah, I would say that's at the least it starts at that category, because usually in our dreams, at least for the most part, we don't realize the difference between that and reality. Sometimes at some point before we wake up, or when we remember it, or whatever, depending on the person and whatever, you might realize that. And oftentimes, like, I've had dreams where I realize it's a dream, but the more I'm like, oh, this is a dream or whatever, I have that kind of thought that like the dream fades away, or I'll wake up and, you know, lose it. So part of it, the dream experience, is believing that it's reality.
Right.
And I mentioned that just because there may be that metaphysical aspect to death or near-death experiences that are some strange thing, even a metaphysical thing, if we dare go there. But I've also mentioned dreams because, you know, a lot of people, especially the mystics in our history, believe often the same thing of dreams.
Yeah.
That dreams, that sometimes they'll make the distinction between what they call shamans and, you know, different people in the more tribal types will be to those who, like, it's just funny because for literally our entire human history, as far back as we have recorded, we have always looked at dreams as being some kind of a message from divine, or divinity of some type, or spirituality or something, which
Yeah, but I think people thought thoughts were the same thing, or impulses, or emotions.
Yeah, I think one distinction that's important to make is like when you're having a dream, most of us we're going to be dreaming from our personal unconscious, and Jung would say that below that is our collective unconscious, and we don't really touch the collective unconscious or our deeper self until we've learned to come to terms with our personal unconscious, which he called our shadow. And so when you have like a, let's say you empty yourself out through meditation or whatever, but you have shadow elements that you haven't dealt with.
Sure.
They can erupt in quite terrifying manner, and they can and if you become identified with them, they can kind of possess you, and you can get into this kind of ego inflation, which even when you touch touch any elements in your unconscious, that's always a risk. In fact, Jung, I think, even said at one point that it's unavoidable. It's just about mitigating that difficulty. But
have any of you guys had the experiences in your dreams where, and sometimes it might be called something like paralysis, but where it seems to affect your physical body, at least as you're transitioning from the dream state to consciousness. And
I'm a chronic sleep paralysis person. I have it very frequently, actually.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it's for me. It's at least once a month, if not more. Where I wake up, I'm still. I can open my eyes. That's about the extent to the control I have over my body. I can't move my arms, can't move my legs, can't talk. I can maybe like go make a noise, but open my eyes and but I can close my eyes and go back to the dream.
When it happens with you, is it usually related to your dreams, or it just happens?
The dream is random. It's just that I can't control my body. I can't speak really. Can't say words or at least anything that's coherent.
So I mean, when these physical events happen, does it just happen, or is it somehow? Okay, because I've had a few like that over the years, but for me, every time that they were related to a what was like a spiritual battle.
I have them more when there's things going on, when I have something really heavy on my mind.
But I mean, in the dream, are there spiritual type of things going on, or visionary type things going on in the dream when that happens?
I don't really have spiritual dreams that much. My dreams are often very personal and related to things that actually happen in real life.
Okay.
That's just, I know other people report different things, but I've also, so I know some people who have sleep paralysis have hallucinations. I don't have that. I just can't move.
Okay. I was going to ask that, because that's what they think alien abductions are, is people have sleep paralysis and then they see something and they think they're being attacked by something.
If that happens to me, it doesn't make its way to the conscious part where I can remember.
Okay.
Interesting.
I haven't had very many sleep paralysis things, but I did have one, and this was many years ago, and I was flying, and I'm scared of heights, so this is kind of, I'm flying, and I was flying. I think, I had some idea. I was like, I saw some cabin or something or other, and it was in a field, and I was like in like Eastern Europe or something, and I don't know, but like between there and me waking up, I was like, I had a few moments of just completely, I couldn't move. It was kind of weird. I don't know. I'm not going to say that I was astral traveling like some people might say. I'm not willing to go that far, but maybe psychologically I was, that flying thing was an odd thing for me, but.
Okay, the reason I ask is, and I wanted to try to get more on the issue of spiritual and religious type experiences, whether they're dream related, drug related, or some of the more religious types that we talked about. But I don't know if I'll get into too much detail with it today, but I have had 3 or 4 what would probably be called sleep paralysis in the sort of, scientific empirical way of dealing with it. But every single time that I've had it, there's been at least 3 or 4, maybe 5, and they were all in the last year and a half. And when those happened, they were all related to what seemed to be a demonic attack, where at least in my dream, and for the most part, I knew it was a dream or something like that. There were these demonic visions trying to kill me, and then as I woke up, it was, at least in a couple of them, it was like suffocating me. And there's others who have experienced that's happened to other people that I've talked to and read about or whatever. So Connor just dipped for a minute, but I want to get more of. Can you still hear Connor? I can't hear you. I can't.
My cat was scratching my bed.
Okay.
Put a kibosh on that.
Could you hear, by the way?
Yeah, I had my headphones on still.
Okay.
They have a long cord.
Okay, I only asked because that's kind of the other area too. Is just it seems like that's another area where sometimes there can be religious experiences is in those deep sort of dream states. And so and again, the main thing I wanted to get into today is just the various, try to find commonalities in the various experiences that we've had.
Well, for me, I don't really have spiritual experiences that much in dreams. I did when I was a kid. I had like lucid dreams, where I could fly or move things with my mind or whatever. But as an adult, I've only really had religious experiences pharmacologically or through meditation. I've had profound meditative experiences, where it's almost like no psychedelic could ever even come close to. And that makes me wonder,
that was meditative.
Completely. Yeah. Like no drugs involved. And I've had experiences meditatively where I almost fear that sometimes I'll never be able to get into those same meditative states, because it felt like I needed that for a long time. And it was like, it was pent up, and I dealt with it all at once or whatever. I remember there was a point in my life where I'd come home every day, lock myself in my room, and just meditate for an hour. And it was like, borderline out of body experiences. And it felt like I had needed that for so long. And that's maybe why I had like the plight that I had. I had depression, anxiety before. And that's why, like I said earlier, I convinced myself that my anxiety was gone or whatever, or that it could never return or whatever. Somehow I had cured anxiety, which, by the way, if you think that, you're denying your humanity, because everybody gets anxiety sometimes.
Yeah, well, and one thing that's interesting that I want to mention, when you said it came back with the pandemic on some level or whatever, it's just that sometimes, and we can make all this progress as individuals, but this is why that there's always going to be this sort of longing to connect with others and help others and be a part of society at large, because we're not just an individual consciousness. And that's why a lot of people are going through, anxiety and panic attacks and everything else with the pandemic, the last few months and everything. It's because we're all connected and we can't do anything about it. So if everybody's going through being on edge and having anxiety because of, these biological things and whatever else, fears, psychological problems, then everybody's going to feel it on some level. And go ahead.
No, I do like that idea. I do sometimes notice that, I don't know how much there is to it empirically, but I will notice that, like, I'll have a rough day, and then my friend had a rough day, and, we attribute it to something collectively. You know, the best thing about it is my girlfriend and I do that. So it's almost like an excuse for both of us being like cranky or in a bad mood or something like that. We can say, oh, you know, it's just something in the air. I don't know how much of that is just like people wanting to attribute their emotions to other people, and how much of it is actually like the fact that we're all connected and stuff like that. I think about that often.
Yeah. Let me kind of bring up another point, since you were on the idea of, well, okay, so you mentioned that you've had a lot of experiences with meditation. Have you also had experiences somewhat similar in what you'd call prayer? Like we've talked about prayer, Connor?
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know, man. I'm kind of like I kind of subscribe to the idea the what the Jews perceive as prayer, which is like you know, the Jews believe that God built us inside of him, built this world inside of himself.
Yeah.
And they say the point of prayer is to contemplate your position inside of the divine.
Right.
And I find that doing so, whether or not it's objectively true, is more beneficial to me than just saying words or spewing utterances to a God. So, but the difference is that those moments can happen when I'm at a birthday party with my family, or if I'm watching my niece or my nephew take their first steps.
Yeah.
You know, I can't talk to God and watch my niece and nephew take their first steps at the same time. What I can do though is I can watch them, maybe, you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
But what I can do for sure is I can watch them do that and then think like, wow, this is an experience that I've never had before, and it's a beautiful thing to watch. I think that's more difficult. And it takes a degree of like discipline and to be conscious of the moments in your life. I think that the key to spirituality, smuggle again, is to find those moments in moments of despair and moments of hardship.
Right.
I think people should start with the good moments and try to find that in the bad moments as they grow and continue.
Milo, have you had experience? It sounds like you've had experience with both, also with some of what you just call meditation, and also some that you'd call prayer to the God that you may have some kind of faith in or reach out to. So I guess I'm just trying to think of how that those similar experience might compare and contrast. So what has been maybe your experience of those phenomena, kind of comparing and contrasting?
Well, I think that what might be more significant is maybe not the experience itself as much as like what exactly precedes it. And I think that the thing that precedes it is this self-emptying, which it kind of occurred to me, Connor, when you mentioned, like, you know, in the Jewish Kabbalistic idea of creation,
right,
is this idea of God emptying out space within himself,
sure,
for creation to occur. And you know, and I think this empty, there's a Greek word kenosis, which is this idea of self-emptying, and it's it's kind of, I think I kind of see it, you know, at least in the Christian tradition, I would say that that's when Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." He's talking about a self-emptying. And an emptying of an attachment to the ego, and you know, if life, you know, we can wait for life to empty us out, right? You know, like Connor said, pay attention to those times when we hit rock bottom and we hit these things, and those are huge opportunities if we turn in the right direction for something mystical to happen to us. Right. But we can also pursue it by by the practice of non-attachment, I think is probably one of the strongest things. Self-observing yourself. Connor, he talked about the observer in us, and that observer, the fact that we can observe ourselves. I mean, think about that a minute. The fact that we can observe ourselves, I can be talking right now, and there's a part of me that can observe me talking right now.
Sure. Totally.
And that's and if you can and paying attention to that observer, it kind of helps to pull away some of these identifications that we have around us, which prevent the self from really coming forward.
Well, I guess specifically though, Milo, and I appreciate.
Maybe I went off on track. Sorry.
No. Those are good points. I'm just, I guess, like I was saying, it sounds like you had experiences with what you just call meditation, and that's and some of it's ongoing, like you guys both talked about, like kind of somewhat always be in a meditative state or being able to always pay attention to the these bigger connecting points, you might say. But I'm just wondering if there's like a difference that you notice, and I'm definitely not trying to like push one or the other or anything like that. I'm trying to just find, even if it's just the way that you look at it, if you've done or had a similar experience where you thought that it was interacting with what maybe even just could be divine versus not that necessarily, but just in a meditative state.
I've had, I had that big one when I was like 14, but I've had a number of them since, and they all kind of, I would characterize them as kind of having the same resonance or same tone to them. I mean, for me, anyhow, it's like, I don't know, a feeling of love kind of being poured over you. And I can feel it in my body, and there's like almost like a sense of like some type of reordering is going on inside my psyche that I'm not even aware of.
But would you say that there's sometimes where you said, if this is you, God, like you described, your first one, and then there's others where maybe it's almost like Sam Harris does, where you're just doing the conscious practice of meditation?
They all share this in common. They're all a letting go, and all of them are a surrender of sorts.
But do you see like a difference or a contrast in when you think there might be a divine thing possible versus when it's just an act of consciousness?
Well, there's a reason why every religion has said to find the divine within yourself.
Yeah, well, I kind of think, when my ego's involved with something, I can have some feelings about certain things, but it's a very different quality. I don't, it's.
Well, let me describe just a little bit of some of my experience like that, and maybe it'll help. And I'm just kind of wondering if anyone has had, I don't know, sort of a similar noticing of the phenomena. But okay, there's a lot of different meditative practices that I might have done over the years, although I haven't done a whole lot that's purely just just me by myself doing nothing, because I find that if I try to do it like there's no God and no spirit about it, it's just consciousness, then feelings or thoughts creep in that seem that same way, and that's fine, whatever that might be. But if I go at it with the conscious goal of, okay, I'm going to do something interacting with divinity, or what seems to be that, and I'll always be questioning it. Like, I don't know what this is because I can't sense it like I can other things, but it could be this. But one thing that I notice is different. And it might just be because of how I put faith in it over the years or put belief in it, but it's because I'm having maybe a different relationship with what could be a personal God, even if it's not that. And the reason is because if I go into the act, we'll say, and there could be a personal God interaction or a divine God interaction. The main difference is then I feel that it's almost like when you're interacting with what could be a person or could be a thought of someone. And you could call it an archetypal experience, like the archetypal experience where you have the thought or the experience with the wise old man, like a Zarathustra type experience. But what that it does is because it's what could be a personal God. That's why I've said in a few posts that it's like the possibility even of a personal God is something that releases you from the ego trap, because otherwise the ego trap is like, yay, I gotta like be more enlightened. I gotta be more enlightened. That's like an egotistical thing. But it releases you from the ego trap because you are surrendering to what could be that sort of separate thing. And then on the other hand, and then the tricky thing about that is I will only want to do that if I'm ready for the responsibility that goes with it. Because, if you go in and interact with what could be a feeling or a idea or a divine whatever that could be something higher, that it's gonna not just like, hey, here's a different personality, but it's gonna potentially make you want to take up more responsibility. So maybe it's just that relationship of things that we put faith in, or even experimentally put faith in, like you talked about, how this is you, God, then. And I think what that is too, like you said, it's the ego transformation, because if we just go at it about like almost like the Sam Harris way of, I'm just gonna see if this is a different type of consciousness. That's what sometimes I talk about, how Jung made the distinction, how where Nietzsche got lost, so to speak, is he got an ego inflation, because in his experiences with his archetypal wise old man Zarathustra, he identified with it too much and he got his own ego inflation, because he's like, okay, I'm going to get my own values now, not from God or religion or anything spiritual, just from my own self. And I think that might be kind of like what I'm getting at, is that if you just say like, I'm going to go get my own thing out of my own enlightenment, then it can cause an ego trap or an ego inflation. Whereas, and you might not necessarily need to call it God all the time or the divine necessarily, or smuggle Jesus in yourself or whatever. But if you go at it as like, this is some higher consciousness that is not me, then it seems, at least from experience that I've had and heard from others with similar experiences, that and Jung might call it the collective unconscious, or the consciousness that's not just of the individual. But if we go at it that way, then I believe that can bring about a bigger transformation. But I don't know, I want to hear more from you guys, what you guys might have had those type of experiences.
The thing about these mystical experiences, that the archetype of death and rebirth,
right,
it plays a very prominent role in all of the literature. Mm-hmm. And there's this sense that there's a part of you, you're touching something that's beyond you,
right,
and it changes who you are. You touch something that's just it's outside of anything that you might have ever thought about. But there's this one mystic in the Orthodox Church, Saint Simeon, the New Theologian, and he described it this way. He said, imagine you're locked up, you're born in a cave, and and you're in this cave for all your life. You come to middle age, and a light breaks through into this cave that you've lived in all of your life.
Sounds a lot like Plato's cave.
Yeah,
And he says it's overwhelming. All you see is light, and it just completely just upends you. He says, but it takes some time. But the more that you experience that light, then you start to be able to see things that you couldn't see before. At first, it's just an overwhelming experience.
Right.
And later, what I think we're talking about is really a transitional stage of consciousness. Often with you have a mystical experience. You break through a little bit somewhere beyond yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And at first, it's disorienting, and it throws you. You're kind of lost. You're overwhelmed, and then after being overwhelmed for a while, now you have access to something that's beyond yourself, and the distinctions begin to form as you have more experience in that way, and there might be a further breakthrough after that.
Most biblical stories are like that, It's like the moment that God calls upon someone, they almost immediately face a hardship.
Mm-hmm.
Or they go blind like Paul.
Yeah, it's not even unique to Christianity, though. It's in Hinduism, it's in Buddhism. I mean, I think that when you get into the mystical literature, there's a whole lot in common, East and West.
Yeah, and one point that I make sometimes, and it's kind of joking, but also very serious too, is that one secret to success, I guess, that I've found in trying to deal with these things and just handle life a little better than maybe when I was less mature, is this idea that it's similar to how I was saying I didn't want to just like get busy again with like busy career, busy relationships, and all that, and those I believe just eventually come on as the course of life, whether that's get into new careers, get into new relationships, whatever. But the idea that sometimes when we like go through like what you talk about, one of these disorienting experiences, whether that's just life or a mystical experience, we try to get back to normal, I guess, whatever that normal is. And I guess what I've been kind of trying to figure out how to do is not be normal again. And maybe that's why sometimes I can come across as a little weird, is because we can kind of get caught up in the whole like fitting into this square peg and whatever else, where it's almost like sometimes I've said about how we're going through this pandemic lately and people are like on edge, and whether if they're not having anxiety or panic, it seems like they're always about to. It's like what I've said is like, I think I'm handling this well because like years ago I just lost my shit and I left it lost. We just lost Connor, but maybe we'll get him back.
He lost his shit.
Yeah, he lost his shit, and hopefully it won't stay lost. But anyway, so I think that's kind of similar to the idea of when we go through these transformative experiences, it can kind of scare the crap out of us, whatever. But if we want to kind of maintain that, but of course find an adaptive way to do so we're not like always running around like a crazy person.
On that point, I think it's Ken Wilber makes some very good points on this, that when you have a breakthrough of consciousness of some sort, often we have this sometimes the only way for us to get there is to demonize our old form of consciousness in some way, and to kind of wrench ourselves from that bondage. And so but where you want to, Ken Wilber said it's really important that you incorporate your previous forms of consciousness with the new consciousness, that there's bridges between them, and that you move past that demonization of your former consciousness, because they are building blocks upon building blocks. And sometimes people get fanatical when they first enter into a new realm, and they just it took them a very destructive force to wrench themselves from it. Their first impulse is to show everybody to destroy this thing that they really actually need. And Ken Wilber makes that point. I think that's very useful.
Well, it reminds me of the sort of mythological idea that Jordan Peterson talks about sort of often, which is the mythological idea of how I forget the exact Egyptian god names. I think it was Horus chopped up Set or whatever.
Osiris was
chopped up by Seth. Yeah.
There you go. Or wasn't it Horus?
Horus defeated Set later.
Yeah.
Okay, that was the different one.
There you go, Jonathan.
There we go. Good memory. Well, anyway, so the idea is when we go through these death, perhaps rebirth processes of consciousness, we don't necessarily want to just burn or bury or destroy the old thing. We want to chop it up and make the world out of its remains. And I think that's kind of the same thing as when we go through these transformative experiences. Really, what happened on in our brain, physically and just mentally, is just like all the wiring got ripped out, in that the structure that we set up to act in the world no longer is going to work, and so it kind of got yanked out, and it's got to be rebuilt. And what you don't want to do is just throw away all those parts, because that you're going to get really frustrated. Because that's actually physically your brain. You've got to, some of those things that are sort of in the past or whatever, or in the old structure, you may want to say, okay, we really want to try to avoid this or that. But some of it you're going to reincorporate, maybe in a different way, or in a more cautious way, or whatever. Or a lot of it too is just how we reorient our values. So a lot of times, we might like some of what I've gone through too is when I went through some more. Sometimes I would be very spiritual, and I'd be very materialistic, and so I would have entrepreneurial things that would be very successful, and I would get very materialistic with my my businesses. And then after that process, and sometimes I think there was some self-destructive parts of that where it's like I didn't want to be that out of balance, where it's like sometimes being all about spiritual or philosophical psychological things, and other times it's just all about financial success. And I think the key is we're always trying to find balance. And what happened then is that's proper is to not be like, I'm never making money again, because it kind of became my downfall of being too high in the value structure. And I think a lot of people go through this sometimes, not everybody, but a lot of people, where at some point, maybe in their 20s or 30s, they're like go through a phase of money is high in the value structure, but then you don't want to move it completely off the value structure. You just want to move it maybe to a lower point in the value structure. But yeah, so I think that's what we're actually doing, is we're redoing our axioms, goals, and value structures, which is something that we've talked about a bit in the past. Jonathan, I haven't heard from you so much, so let me know any thoughts or ideas you have, maybe more so from your different perspective or background.
I think you met your quota.
Yeah, I think so.
I guess Connor's not coming back, so one of the problems we have today, right now, with the protests is we're trying to reorient our hierarchy of values so that we can actually navigate in any meaningful sense. So yeah, that definitely relates to the modern day. But
well, and I'll say real quick that again, the reason we got on this subject last week is when it was us and Radu, and he was making the point a couple times how we were more so talking just about God and religion in general, but he was talking about how it's not an empirical thing, as that we try to discuss it, but it's an experiential thing, maybe subjective, and maybe we can get into that a little bit. But so all of this has to be quantified on a on a different realm, and so I don't know if you guys want to try to go there a bit as just as far as how that we can maybe quantify our religious type things, and if we can grapple with them in any kind of an empirical way.
Yeah, I think, this is kind of like one of the fields where Jung would talk about, that, in science, if you have a theory of something and you apply the scientific method to it and it shows out that it's false, you just throw away the theory and you move on to the next one, or you modify it.
Right.
In the psyche, things are different. In the psyche, every phenomenon in the psyche is a psychological fact. Whether it has a good or bad effect, you can't deny that it has it as a phenomenon. The phenomenon's in the psyche, and so if you have a phenomenon in the psyche that has a bad effect, you can't throw it away. The only thing you can do with it is transform it. And
Right.
And so when you're trying to navigate these things, some of the things that we can look at is, are you able to, does this aid in your adaptation to life?
Okay.
And Jung emphasized this quite extensively, and I think that's what kept him sane through a period of his own crisis.
Right.
Was his commitment to responsibilities in life.
Mm.
And he talks some bit about that. So I think when you're looking at these psychic occurrences, you go through one of these mystical experiences. If you attach your ego to that experience and you identify with it, all of a sudden you're the Messiah.
Yeah.
And you've got to convert people, and these things can go wrong.
Right.
So there is a danger in what you do with these things.
Right.
They can, if they get contained by the ego and the complexes of the ego and our personal shadow, these can turn into all kinds of problematic things. But on the other hand, like Jung talked about this Saint von Flew. He was a saint in Switzerland, and he had these visions. And he was this close to insanity. He would have gone insane, Jung said, if it hadn't been for the dogma of the church to make sense of it. Right. So dogma, in some senses, can be a positive thing, and if taken in the other way, they can also be a negative thing, if the ego's involved. So, and it's it is kind of a dangerous territory where it's sometimes really hard to find help in navigating things if you have an experience like this.
Yeah, that's why Jung and Nietzsche and some of them, probably even Peterson, can be really helpful as people might go through these type of experiences.
Jung, I think he really he gets it, and it doesn't really matter what your religious beliefs are or not with Jung. That he's dealing with psychological phenomena, and it is what it is. But
the other point I'll try to make briefly, if I can, with Jung is he went through probably 2 transformations himself, and a lot of people don't realize there was the second one. But so first off, he was just like a young sort of regular doctor, you might say, and that's when he was starting his career, sort of being mentored by Freud. And then when he wrote volume 5, I believe, of his collected works, which was it's kind of strange because he wasn't trying to directly be in opposition to Freud. It just was the case. His theory of things were very much in opposition to the way that Freud was. But at that, the way that came about, and the way that there were some other things in his life at the time that caused that process that led to the Red Book, which I know you're reading right now, Milo, and which is the process of him going through these psychological and probably mystical experiences just by himself for the most part for I think it was 3 years. And then after that, he figured out how to get back to life. And then he was for basically between World War I and World War II, he was basically the normal-ish psychologist that we know him as. But then it was basically, I forget the exact years, but when he was, I think, in the middle of writing volume 9, so volume 9 has collective unconscious, archetypes, collective unconscious, and then Aeon. And then in Aeon is when he got into sort of this other experience, because he almost died. I forget the exact disease. I think he was having a series of diseases when he was in his 50s at the time. And so that experience put him into another level of sort of what people looked at as mysticism. But that's when he started writing more in a way of just more what's the word, implicit rather than explicit. Okay, here's all this about alchemy and religion, and figure it out. And I mention all that because we will often go through these transformational things in our life and in these religious or divine type experiences, and we've got to figure out how to get the most out of them. And that's what he was really doing. And his critique on Nietzsche was really helpful because what Nietzsche went through a similar experience, but it kind of went the wrong way, like I've mentioned. So yeah, I don't know. Still want to hear more from you guys on your religious experiences or take on it.
It's an hour and a half, so
yeah,
it might be about time to close.
Okay,
well, Connor left.
Yeah. I thought we'd hear more from him, but he's always a tease with all that, because I really wanted to hear more about his psychedelic experiences, which was where I was. It sounds, Milo, like you haven't really had any psychedelic or drug experiences, or not any.
No, I haven't.
Yeah.
Although sometimes I wonder, how what my experience was like compared to it, but I have never done psychedelics.
Yeah, same. The only experiences I have with drugs is just stuff I help to go to sleep, because I'm a terrible sleeper. I'll take 4 or 5 melatonin tablets and it won't do a thing. I have that gene, so sometimes I'll take diphenhydramine or something, and I used to do that as a kid sometimes, and it helped me go to sleep. I didn't see anything. Made me feel interesting, but it didn't make me see anything. So, yeah, I've never had any psychedelic experience.
Have you ever had any dream experiences, by the way, or that seemed more than just a dream, at least at the time?
I had an interesting dream shortly after the mystical experience I had when I was 14. Well, a number of dreams, but one of them was I was running away from this giant boar that its back would have been 5 feet off the ground, and it had tusks that were 6-7 inches long, and it was coming after me, and it was all this rooted up ground, and the and it was frozen, so I kept tripping over it, and I'm trying to get toward this fence, and I keep falling, and this big boar's coming after me, and I finally get to the fence, and I'm just out of energy. I don't have anything left. I barely just throw myself over the fence, and I turn and I look at this boar coming at me, and it goes right through the fence, and it just starts eating my face.
Wow.
But
Darn.
once I jumped over the fence, I was completely at peace. I had no fear of this boar. As it went through the fence, I was completely at peace. As it was eating me, I was completely at peace. It didn't matter that it was eating me. But I was at great fear. But once I jumped over the fence, then it didn't matter. You know, he can eat me if he wants. It was
Interesting.
Wow. Oh, Isaac, I slightly lied there. I did have one experience that was a little interesting based on drugs, but it wasn't psychedelics. It was the first time I took my beta blocker because I get migraines a lot, and propranolol is a good treatment for an abortive or preventative drug for migraines. And when I first started taking it, I had the only time I've ever had a lucid dream. It was my dead parents, and I realized, wait, my parents are dead. How are they here right now? And I was like, oh, I'm in a dream. And so I was like, I would like push myself awake out of that situation, but I was in a lucid dream for like 2 seconds. And so I do remember that one incident. So, but that's it. I haven't had anything else. Hopefully. I don't remember anything else.
Connor says he's trying to get back in, but we'll see. And maybe this is a sign from the universe or whatever that this is our last StreamYard cast, because
I might. Let me throw in.
We're going to be on Zoom from now on, but go ahead.
A couple of, if you're interested in it, I think Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley is very good in approaching this subject. It takes into account like Eastern and Western thoughts along these lines. And in the Western tradition, a very good book is Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill. It's very comprehensive of Western mysticism. And you know what? Can I just throw in one little thought that Saint John of the Cross is very significant in this, and he talks about the dark night of the soul, and what many people are not aware of. There's also the dark night of the spirit, and the dark night of the soul is kind of moving beyond your personal ego and your personal self. And the dark night of the spirit is letting go of even your concept of God and your theology and all thought on the matter. So there is like in his stuff is very good, but it comes from a Christian perspective, but it corresponds with much in the East as well. So I just like throw those in there if people. I would recommend a lot of Ken Wilber is good with consciousness and changes and growth in consciousness.
Let me see if I can briefly talk about some of my dream experience, or just overall, is that I had, when I was really young, like Connor's talking about some of his first bad dreams, when I was like, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years old, I would from time to time have, like monster dreams, sort of nightmares. And usually I think they would make me wake up, and, just like a kid might be sometimes, like, I had a bad dream. And then my, hold on. All right, Connor, I can't hear you. Okay, now I can hear you, sort of. Okay. So, okay, I don't know what all you missed, but I'm just briefly talking about some of my dream experience, and then I want to get into some of maybe yours and psychedelics, and we'll wrap it up.
Sure.
But, okay, so I had this weird thing where, so when I was young, I would have like nightmares, like really young, like 6, 7 years old. And then I went to my family. I'm like, oh, what should I do about this? And then my older sister at the time, who I don't know if she had lucid dreams or just had some advice that she heard somewhere or dealt with it herself. And she's like, when that happens, just don't believe in it. Don't just realize that it's not real, and then it can't hurt you. And I was like, oh, okay. But then after that, like almost any dream that I would be conscious of it would become, to the degree that I would want it to, would become a lucid dream. Except sometimes I would try to not get involved in it too much, because then the dream would end after a little bit. But then what was strange is even just from then, when I'm like probably about 7 years old up until recently in my life, if I have sort of monster-like things or nightmare-type things in my dreams, there's this weird thing where, like, in that sort of monster nightmare thing, they want to at least do some sort of psychological scary things. But for the most part, it's like I'm Neo in the Matrix and they can't touch me. And some of that went into how I had those experiences in the last couple of years, a few times where it seemed that way, they still tried. And then as that they were, it was like kind of like the last resort that I got, like once in a while. I was like, okay, if you're going to hurt me, then I'll just wake up. But then those times, like in the last couple of years, are where then it would be like really bad sleep paralysis, and a couple of times where even I was like almost couldn't breathe. So that's some of my dream experience. But Connor, I want to hear more from you maybe on that, but also one thing that we kind of got into off and on the last few weeks when you weren't here, but then we're like, I wonder what Connor and BJ think, is want to hear more about your psychedelic experience and how that you believe that might compare or contrast with other religious experiences that we've talked about.
Okay, well, for me, the psychedelic experience was something deeply personal. So I always am cautious about how much I reveal about that experience or pertaining to that experience.
Sure.
What I will say is that my first time having so I'm from Washington. Mushrooms grow here like weeds. So I had some experiences with those before I had a religious context, and I didn't, have a religious experience with them. It wasn't until after I had at least a low resolution conception of religious context that I actually had an experience that was transformative and connective and everything like that. I guess
this was a couple years ago.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just share one personal experience that I had, and you guys can psychoanalyze it all you want and make whatever assumptions you need to make about it. I had an experience where I was looking into the sky and I saw, I guess you could say a god. It was a divine figure that was a woman, and she spoke utterances that I could understand, even though I had never been trained in that kind of language. And if I could extrapolate one thing that she said that was profound, was that I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing. And I know that sounds kind of arrogant, because it makes it sound like I have this task, but I do believe that we all have a task that we were put here to do. Even the most depressed person and the most nihilistic person has certainly had an impact on somebody in their life that has been beneficial, whether they know it or not. I've met people who are, some might consider miscreants, who I think have actually had a positive impact on certain people in their life or certain experiences. So that's what I was able to get out of the gist of the experience. And beyond that, I couldn't help but feel that I wasn't interacting with the world enough, I was, people say this a lot nowadays, but I feel like I was just existing,
So you're talking about the transformation of like before and after.
Sure, exactly. I was eating, you know, I was sleeping, I was talking to people when I felt lonely, you know, or when I felt like I needed social interaction, but I wasn't actually looking at it from the perspective of, let's say, what we were talking about earlier, the conscious observer that I think that we really all are, the person who's like not just experiencing it, but, you know, and you have a little bit of control over that. You can choose to say, okay, well, I'm going to look at this from kind of an outside view. I feel like that's where Jordan Peterson's rule comes from, is to treat yourself like somebody you're responsible for taking care of. You know, you can do that. It's a meditative thought experiment where you can say, okay, I'm not just me. I'm also like the person who's responsible for me because nobody else is. Surprise, surprise. Took me a while to learn that. But to be able to like go into that state and be like, okay, I am the person who's responsible for me, and I'm also the person who's experiencing me, really gave me some insight into how little I was actually interacting with the world and how little I actually was living up to my capacity before that experience. So that's, you know, my personal anecdote, I suppose.
So
you know,
go ahead.
You know what comes to mind is, you know, Jung's would say that our soul, for men, is often appears as a woman in our psyche. That when our deeper self often takes the form of a woman for men, and for women, their animus. It's not even always singular for a woman because it's often many thoughts and many different.
Sure.
But for men, it's often that an encounter with the self, the deeper self, often takes the form of a woman. I mean, it just popped into my head. I'm, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, I agree with that. But also the other thing that I've really noticed that with psychedelic experiences is that it really feels like what you're seeing isn't being generated from yourself, because, you know, like you could easily generate, you know, what did my girlfriend really mean when she said that yesterday, or what did this person really, what was their,
what does this emoji mean?
Right, exactly. That seems like easy to extrapolate out of myself. The unprecedented feeling that I get when I experience psychedelics, which I've only done a few limited amount of times, is that I don't have the capacity to generate what I'm seeing, which I think is interesting. But you know, but there's also the maybe the more logical explanation was that, you know, you're capable of generating more than you think, which you know, you could surely make an argument for that. I just don't sense that when I'm experiencing these things.
I think there's something significant about seeing elements in the psyche as other. You know, we kind of train ourselves to think that we're one. We think that we're one. We're not many. We don't have, you know. And I think that the mysterious psyche that lies beneath our conscious ego, we don't necessarily have control on it. It's other to our conscious ego, and when we see it, you know, in an autonomous form, it's disconcerting. You know, when you're identified with your ego self. But Jung and a lot of the depth psychologists will all say, you know, we have there are autonomous elements within us, you know, and you can call them angels and demons. You can call them, you know, your anima, your animus. And they may all, they have their different archetypes of sorts. So
they're different motivational structures. They're different value structures. They're different.
Yeah, and I believe Jung did say that the living personalities inside you can sometimes be so strong that they present themselves to you as literal entities.
Yeah. So. I've even heard that if you take the worldview of angels and demons in the psyche, that you have more success with schizophrenics than just trying to convince, you know, than other methods that for them to like see these things external to themselves aids in their ability to start to create any kind of order if they're able to at all.
Well, that's an interesting thing too. The word schizophrenic is interesting because in the West, we take people who have auditory and visual hallucinations at a young age, and we call them schizophrenic. And in the East, or not, sorry, the East, in indigenous tribes, they're actually generally those people are revered and guided to become some kind of like medicine man or shaman of the culture. I want to talk to you guys about something that I think is kind of interesting that I recently was thinking about. Some people don't have an inner monologue. Did you guys know that? There are people who claim to not have the voice in their head that says things, that narrates their life, if you will. So I don't know how familiar you guys are with Marin Jelajov. He's in the network here. He could be like watching this right now. But he's a doctor in Bulgaria. He's also an evolutionary psychologist. And one of the things that many evolutionary psychologists speculate on is the idea that as we were becoming self-conscious, we developed the ability to hear things that you could say are akin to thoughts that didn't exist within. Because it wasn't until the argument is that it wasn't until we developed an ego that we compartmentalized thoughts to think that they were generating from ourselves. So the prehistoric mythic man, if you will, for whatever word you want to use, ancient man, would actually experience these thoughts as external voices. Like the voice of God telling you, go into the woods and find wood for the tribe, or go hunt this animal so that your family can eat or whatever. And it wasn't until we developed an ego that we compartmentalized those thoughts. And it kind of makes me wonder, like, how much of that is metaphysical and how much of that is just like the plight of evolution.
Oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
No, you can do yours first, I guess.
That was there's a book, How Natives Think, by Levi Bruhl. And he was very influential in Jung, because he started to look at these primitive peoples and looked at their psychology, and and they didn't have an ego. They projected everything on their environment, and so when the tree branch broke, a piece of that person broke, and there was this he called it the partition mystique. This where you're kind of one with nature kind of thing,
right?
And you would identify, and they would identify with animals, and if something happened to the animal, it happened to them, and their psyche became kind of bonded with what was around them. And it was the withdrawing of those projections that was the beginning of consciousness.
And that might have been the result of literacy, to be able to be a third party experiencing somebody else's writings,
You can see these words are like almost like bridges.
Yeah, well, and if you look at the way our brains are formed, Peterson gets into this a little bit, but more of the people that are more into the neuroscience might a bit more, but that the front of our brain, which are prefrontal cortex, that's as much as we can tell, it's sort of the new kid on the block in our physical brain, which is what makes up language. So our brains are very similar to that of animals, and I don't know all the ways to compare and contrast that with animals, but animals think very similar to how we think. I mean, of course, it's going to be different depending on how much they're like us, but they just don't. They haven't developed language like we have. It's interesting as how that as that became onto our brain, that we have language and that we can think more in abstraction, not just like, oh, here's a tree, here's an animal, here's this world that I'm in, but we can, put everything into an abstract form in our minds.
Sure. It's very akin to the Alan Watts idea that, like, we like to think of ourselves as the end result of a universal process that is the Big Bang. But if we all are in agreement that the Big Bang is still happening and the universe is still expanding, then we have to come to terms with the idea that we're not the end result of a process. We're the process unfolding right now.
Right. Yeah. So that's a lot we covered. It is, and I feel like sometimes we need to often remember that we're somewhere in the middle. We don't know where in the middle, if we're like 90% there or 10% there, or
in an infinite process that continues forever.
Right. And maybe there will be a singularity and it'll start over. We don't even really know. There's a but yeah, and including that of our brains. Like sometimes I think about they took, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the story of Einstein's brain, but his brain was physically stolen and nobody knew what happened to it for a long time. And then they found it, and the guy who stole it, he was like kept it and studied it in his secretly, in his basement or whatever for decades. But then when they were actually able to be like, okay, this is Einstein's brain, I guess we'll see what's up with it. But it was about 17% larger than I don't know if it average or like it should have been, or like anybody else's brain, but it's 17% average. So if you think about it, the brain has the brain has what, 100 billion neurons, something like that. But so 70% larger, but it also had additional folds. And I don't know if that's just because his brain had grown so much. And I think we haven't been able to scientifically make this a case for this. But so this is what seems more like real evolution, more than because it's hard to make the case for evolution as the mutation state, just because mutations are so random and they have to be something that will be a mutation that will also happen in such a way that it will be heritable to the next generation.
Sure.
And help for their survival. So what's still sort of developing in the evolutionary theory that makes a lot more sense is this idea that if we do more novel things, like even abstract thinking like Einstein did, it causes our DNA to change. So like sometimes just if we do more adventurous things in our life or in our experience or in our work or relationships or whatever, it unlocks DNA potential and changes our DNA, and that can even be heritable onto the next generation.
Right.
So, are you referring to epigenetics?
Yeah.
I think it's a lot more complicated than just you do X, Y, and Z and then your genetics change.
Can I give my example of epigenetics, and maybe Jonathan can correct me?
It's still a developing thing, and there's aspects of it. But go ahead, Connor.
I had a friend who, just a star student, right? Honors classes, had college credits in high school, star soccer player, brilliant musician. He was popular. He had good looking girlfriends when he was in high school. And all of a sudden, we used to smoke pot before high school. And all of a sudden I kind of started to notice that when we would smoke pot, he would say really bizarre things. Like he would accuse me of things that were just absolutely ridiculous, right? Like things that nobody would ever do. And it later turned out that he had schizophrenia. Now, it could have been a multitude of things that brought out that schizophrenia in him. But for whatever reason, the catalyst for him was marijuana, which is interesting because most people can smoke marijuana, have a good or bad experience, and then 5 hours later, they're fine. 4 hours later, they're fine. For him, because he had the genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, that brought it out of him. And that's my understanding of epigenetics. Is that's like beyond genetics. Like that's him having like cancer is kind of like epigenetics too, because everybody has the cancer gene. It just takes a catalyst to bring it about.
You know it's another thing that's interesting about Einstein.
Yeah.
He didn't learn to read and write till he was like 8 or something.
Yeah.
He was very slow to learning language.
Right.
Which if you're slow to learning language, then you're computing the world very differently earlier on. You're not computing it the way all the other kids are if you're not reading and writing through those ages.
Well, all kids have the desire to utter words, but but you have to teach reading and writing, and it's hard. Right. Every kid wants to talk. But unless you expose a kid to the idea of reading and writing, they'll never do it themselves, and that's a weird thing.
Yeah, and there's still about 10% of the world, something between 10 and 15% of the world, even in America, that is illiterate, and some of that is just to the fact that roughly 10% has a IQ of about 85 or less. But some of it is just that people never learn for whatever reason, and some of them you might even not suspect that. But and I think Jordan Peterson talked about a couple times how that there's a couple of these like spiritual natives that he had developed friendships with, and their mind would work very differently because they developed language at a slower rate and differently, being illiterate. But they could still talk and communicate and everything else, but they just had a different relationship with language.
You can teach people to do things pretty fast, even if they're, like we've encountered civilizations and taught them how to use planes. And meanwhile, they've never had any outside communication with human beings before, and they're primitive, and yet we can teach them to fly planes within a year. So
yeah, well, and all this is just on the topic of that. Epigenetics is tricky, but also, there's offshoots of the theory, just in that we are. It's like how we talked about how these religious type experiences will cause a change in our minds, our psychology, and our disposition and our personality, and I believe to a certain degree, if that's been significant, it's probably physically a rewiring of your brain to a large degree, which is why it can be such a painful process, and people get stuck in a depression because you're physically having your brain rewired as you rebuild your value structures, you rebuild the way that you.
How similar is epigenetics with neuroplasticity? Do any of you guys know? Is it kind of the same thing?
I don't think so. Like neuroplasticity isn't it just when the brain can easily respond to potentially violent changes and recover, and epigenetics is just changes in the organism by responding to just gene expression differences rather than
I think that's the right way to differentiate it. Okay, just want to check.
Yeah, but it's a complex subject that I'm not really an expert in, but I mentioned Einstein's brain and all this just because I believe a lot of this is how that our brains evolved. Like if you look at the average IQ now, like I forget the exact numbers now, but the average IQ now has just gone up like massively in the past couple hundred years. And
that's because of access to food.
I've heard that.
There's
that's what
that's part of it.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't say absolutely. That's just the accepted consensus.
That's definitely part of it, and it's also comes from how that we interact with the world, like the world being more of a puzzle, even just in how that we have to get around through traffic or navigate through.
That makes sense too.
Of subway signs and all these things,
That's a good point.
That make us exercise our IQ. But then I believe some of it then is heritable, and that sort of field is still emerging. But I think
and very controversial.
Yeah, it's very controversial. But I think that Einstein's brain brings up interesting thing and they've only really had full access to that information the last few years.
Sure.
Which is why they're trying to figure out, like, okay, how much of that did he inherit? How much of that could he potentially have had passed down genetically?
Sure.
And how much of it is because of him working with these complex problems?
Yeah.
Over the course
it's nature versus nurture question.
Right.
Yeah. You've heard of the conversation with Einstein and Marilyn Monroe?
Mm-mm.
Marilyn Monroe says to Einstein, she says, "Man, we should get together, you and I, with my looks and your brains. Can you imagine our offspring?" And Einstein says, "Well, you never know. They might have my looks and your brains."
Oh, that's funny. That's a good point.
Funny guy.
Well, yeah, I mean, Connor, there's a reason why it's a controversial subject, is because people use epigenetics.
Yeah, let's be really cautious here.
Yeah, there are peddlers that will use that, and that's their calling card. They'll sell that, and people will buy it, and they'll get rich off of bullshit. And the whole point is that we've got to be really careful with the claim of epigenetics.
Right, and that's the how the manifestation of games like Lumosity have come about.
Oh yeah.
You can raise your IQ by playing these ultimately arbitrary games.
Right. Yeah. Or you can eat certain things or use certain chemicals, and now you age slower or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, there's some. There's some okay, so what did they figured out? So it's that if you're doing the same thing, so like this, if you'll get better at the same game, but there's not evidence necessarily that they figured out for sure that, like, okay, if you play these cognitive type of games, then for sure that's going to translate into doing other cognitive.
Yeah, I think there's better evidence to show that certain substances or foods can improve your cognition way more than those games.
Right. Well, and what they've said is basically
lion's mane's the big craze, right? Sorry, not to interrupt you, but lion's mane is the big craze right now because there was a series of Harvard studies where they taught these rats how to do these mazes, and then they injected them with a neurotoxin that made them forget how to do these mazes, and then administered lion's mane, which is a type of mushroom, every day for 2 weeks, and they were able to retain the memory of how to do the mazes without being retaught. And that was that. To me, that was the most, like, I've seen a lot of, like, I've research on nootropics and stuff like that. To me, that was the first inkling of, like, okay, maybe what you ingest can actually make a difference on your cognition.
To look that up.
Yeah, there's a few different ways to go with that. So one is what a lot of the more, I don't know, serious type scientists, even Jordan Peterson will say, it's not that what you ingest necessarily makes you smarter. It's that if you have malnutrition, it gives you less access to your IQ or your
well, that's a different. Yeah, that's a right. Well, I think what it is that in the past, if you don't have the ability to get food without working really, really hard, then most of your psyche is allocated to being good at finding food. But if all of a sudden you can walk 5 minutes down the road and do a function,
and Postmates shows up,
or press a button and Postmates showed up, exactly. You don't have to think that much about food, and therefore your brain can kind of start reorganizing to think about other things beyond that.
Right. I mean, it's tricky. I mean, I've listened to a lot of the lectures by Robert Sapolsky, and he will say that there are certain, I forget the exact things that he listed as far as nutritional things that your brain's, I think calcium is one of them, and just certain common nutritional things that if your diet is too low in certain nutrients, your brain won't work as well as it could.
See, I've never heard that. So there's a physical aspect of it too, not just yeah.
And what that is, that goes into the neurotoxins, in that to make the neurotoxins for your neurons communicating to each other, they take a certain I forget what the chemistry is, but they take a certain chemistry, and we'll wrap up in a minute anyway. But which is interesting, because I was going to say on that subject, Robert Sapolsky has talked about it a bit, is that, what he says is that the psychedelic experience is because normally what's happening between our neurons is there's these chemicals shooting back and forth, and to us that seems like vision, or whether they are real or imagined, and voices, whether they're real or imagined. And that's normally what's going on, is our neurons are firing back and forth with the neurochemicals between them. And the psychedelics drugs do the same thing, but with a little bit different neurochemistry. And so then that's why it sounds like voices, and it produces sometimes dreamlike visions.
Yeah.
And they might manifest in a lot of different ways, and because it's the same type of brain chemistry, and then we might interpret that however that we're going to.
Yeah, there's definitely some truth to that idea, because all the major psychedelics are just serotonin derivatives, and I use that word derivative like very literally, like they're very, very minorly different from each other.
Yeah.
I would say the difference, or I would say the nuance of it is that we should be really careful what we call a hallucination, because a lot of what your mind is doing all the time is just creating an image that's practical and pragmatic, and creating, the senses that you need to only extrapolate what's useful to you.
Right.
One of the things that they found that psychedelics do is they connect parts of the brain that aren't normally connected, but they also disconnect parts that are normally connected. So one of the postulations that arises of that is how much of your brain is just allocated to ignoring information, right? Because there's so much information around me. I mean, this laptop is to the left of my microphone right now, and then this vase behind that you can't see is to the left of that, and then, or take a brick wall. This brick is to the left of this brick. You couldn't possibly absorb all those facts all at once. But one of the ideas is that psychedelics make it so they break down some of those barriers, some of the parts of your brain that are designed to ignore information that isn't generally useful to you, and actually be able to experience that. That's it's definitely an interesting thought experiment, to wonder how much of what you see all the time is only being presented to you because your need for survival finds it beneficial enough to where your mind would show it to you.
Yeah. Well, Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot too, is that the way our eyeballs are wired is that our fovea is just going to focus on whatever we're going to focus on. Like if I'm going to focus on my computer screen, my webcam, my microphone, or whatever, I see exactly that thing that I'm focusing on. And then everything else I don't really even see. That's everything else that I'm not focusing on that's in my periphery. It actually is more like a dream. I mean, now I might be able to take like a low resolution of like, I look at all this, my apartment or whatever. But it's because I can't really get a high resolution of all that information. My mind just kind of actually has all these images that it just puts together, and it says that's what it is, even if that's not exactly what it is. That's why, for example, there's so many accidents from things like texting and driving, because if you're focused on your phone, you think you see that whole outside world that's outside of the car, but it's actually just these images that your mind says are there. And you just kind of see like blurriness. And so then it's hard to react if something out of the ordinary happens.
Right.
Have you guys heard
dream? But go ahead.
Have you heard that? Jordan Peterson recites this study where there was these two teams that a white team and a black team, and they had a basketball, and they told everybody to count how many times the white team touches the ball, something along these lines, and a bunch of people watch it. But in the middle of it, they send out a guy in a gorilla suit dancing around the middle of the court and then walking off the stage.
Right.
And half the people watching this never saw the gorilla.
Right.
You know,
because they're focused on their goal, and the point that he makes that's interesting is what you do is you build out a value structure with goals. So I've seen that lecture that he's given a couple times on that, where he says, you'll ask the classes like, why is it important? And it's because you're sort of making a egotistical, goal-oriented thing. Like, I want to be good at this and know how smart I am and all that stuff. And so then you block out, because it's a little bit challenging to count these basketball passes. You kind of don't realize that you're doing it probably, but you block out the whole world. And then in the lectures that he gave later in the class that he did online, and then I think in his 2017 version, he showed that there was because so many people saw the one from 2001 or whatever it was, he did an updated one where originally he didn't tell them, but so a lot of people are gonna be like, oh yeah, I saw the gorilla, but in the updated one, they had one of the basketball players or whatever it was, basketball passers that had a black shirt disappear, and most people didn't see that. And then also there was the curtain behind them rather than just a white wall, but the curtain changed from, it was at the beginning it was definitely red, at the end it was definitely gold, I think, and then people didn't notice that. But what that is it's just the way that we're set up to be really focused on things based on our goals.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I forget, why did we get on the
I don't know.
I'm not sure, but go ahead.
We're way off topic. Yeah.
I think maybe connected to this is the correlation, I think, that Peterson talks about between psychedelics or actual mystical experiences from psychedelics and an increase in openness in their personality type.
Yes.
Right.
And which kind of implies you don't have as rigid a way of organizing things as prior to that.
Well, it makes sense that left-leaning people too are more drawn to psychedelics for that reason, I suppose.
Yeah.
The literature is clear that liberally minded people are higher in openness as well. Yeah, but we're a little off topic, so.
Well, yeah, it was all on the idea.
I have to be out of here by 7:30, just so you know.
Okay, we're about to wrap it up anyway. But yes, it was all on the idea of how consciousness works at every level and what's going on with that and what our place is in it and how that we experience religious type things. And the reason we got on that from last week again was that all these things of what we call spiritual, religious, or divine is like an experiential, maybe subjective thing. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how to make them intersubjective or transsubjective, since we can't completely make them objective. Maybe even, like I said at the beginning, try to make them empirical. Like we can say personality is empirical. So that's what we're trying to get at, is the commonalities and distinction between the different types of experiences. But we'll wrap it up and we'll get on some other subjects in the coming weeks. I'm going to have on some other people too that will go on the same idea. I want to get on with BJ. I talked to your friend a little bit. What's his name? Cedric. He and I have a couple things in common, and I have him on as well. Cedric Knight, and get some.
Yeah. He has a podcast called The Nightly Word.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk to him probably next week, and hopefully BJ too. But yeah, anybody have anything else you want to add before we wrap it up? And
I think that in one of the future things, I would like to kind of talk about mystical experience and their relation to metaphysics.
Sure.
I think that would be.
Yeah, I thought BJ would be here for that, but he didn't.
Yeah.
I think
hopefully he could probably be next time.
Yeah.
I probably won't be able to be here the next 2 weeks because next week my wife and 2 kids are going to be in the redwoods in Yosemite. That'll be fun.
Have fun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my wife's been teaching like a mad woman, so she
Oh,
needs
cool.
a vacay, and I have a prelim coming up, so I need a break studying too. So
July 6th, BJ and I are doing a live event where we're going to talk about just really brief 15 minutes of us just kind of breaking down the direction that we're going to take the daily discussion and how we're going to revivify it. We're going to announce like a few different new segments of the daily discussion, which will become like the daily discussion will become kind of like an umbrella for those things. And
what time do you think you'll do that? Because I might be able to do that, but
it'll be July 6th. It'll be just BJ and I, probably around like probably around 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. But there will be a Facebook event for it. So
okay, yeah, I'll probably be in the air by then. But yeah,
Wow.
Okay.
All right, guys. All right. Well, thanks a lot, and yeah, we'll keep cracking away at this and any other subjects. And when are you going to be back? By the way, Jonathan.
I think we fly back on the 17th. Let me see the exact date here.
Okay.
I think after the 3rd week, I'll be ready. The next either Monday or Tuesday. Yeah, I'm back for certain Friday evening on the 17th.
cool.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Next
Oh, yeah.
episode could be metaphysics and reality versus religious experience or something like that.
See, that's the one I wanted to do. I wanted to talk to and figure out where me and BJ.
I will personally make sure that BJ will be there. So
Okay. Yeah, and if we do one that's on this kind of thing that you're interested in, we can always do a follow up. I asked about your schedule too because probably toward the end of the month, I want to hear more from especially Jonathan and Jesse.
yes,
on the subject of education because we were going to get into that.
Yeah.
That whole can of worms and everything else. So we'll do that probably toward the end of the month.
Cool.
And yeah.
Cool.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot. And stay tuned.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah. Anytime,
Yeah.
Connor.
Great discussion, guys.
Yeah, great talking to you, all of you.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, guys. And
All right.
yeah, we'll see you in the coming weeks and have fun with any trips and all that. So thanks, guys.
Yeah, have fun at the Redwoods. See you
Yeah.
later, Milo. See you
All right.
later, Isaac.
All right.